Part 14. Loken's Betrayal. Meanwhile, unbeknownst to Sargeras, the last embers of the Pantheon's power clung to life. Although Sargeras had destroyed the Titans' physical forms, Norgannon's grand spellwork had preserved their souls. The disembodied Titan spirits hurtled through the great dark toward the world of Azeroth and its keepers. There, the Pantheon hoped they could locate physical forms to inhabit. If they could not find such vessels, the Titans feared their weakened spirits would soon fade into oblivion. Upon reaching Azeroth, the depleted spirits slammed into the Keepers, who had been crafted by the Pantheon's own hands. The Keepers were immediately overwhelmed as the Titans' powers flared into their minds. They witnessed fragmented memories of distant worlds, of lifetimes never lived, and wonders never seen. But just as quickly as the influx of power had come, it dimmed. The Keepers, still retaining their original personalities, puzzled over the strange phenomenon. They knew they had been gifted with a portion of the Pantheon's power, but they were unaware that the last remnants of their beloved makers had been infused in their very bodies. The bewildered servants called out to the Pantheon for answers, but they received no reply. The deep silence troubled the Keepers, and they sank into a long period of confusion and unease. The old god Yogg-Saron, imprisoned beneath Ulduar, sensed these fluctuating emotions. In the eons since the ordering of Azeroth, a sharp awareness had begun to stir within the entity. Yogg-Saron had devised a plan to weaken its jailers and escape imprisonment. It would corrupt the Forge of Wills, tainting its creation matrix with a strange malady known as the Curse of Flesh. Any Titan Forge created by the machines thereafter would fall victim to this affliction. Some would even spread it to previous generations of Titan Forged. The Curse of Flesh would gradually transform many of these infected servants into mortal beings of flesh and blood, beings who the cunning old god knew could be easily killed. To implement this plan, Yogg-Saron turned to Keeper Loken. Out of Ulduar's guardians, Loken had been the most troubled by the Pantheon's silence. Yogg-Saron assailed the Keeper through fevered dreams, stoking the cold fires of his despair. Yet even in the disturbed state, Loken resisted the whisperings in his mind. Ultimately, his downfall would come from a much subtler place. As Loken drifted deeper and deeper into despair, he sought comfort from a Vrykul named Sif, the mate of his brother, Keeper Thorim. Loken often met with Sif in private, telling her of his darkest fears. In time, a forbidden love blossomed between the two Titanforged. Yogg-Saron latched onto Loken's love for Sif and twisted it into a dangerous obsession. The relationship quickly soured due to Loken's increasingly compulsive behaviour. More and more, he talked of openly professing their love for each other, an act that Sif vehemently opposed. She knew that if Thorim discovered the affair, it would shatter the Keeper's unity. Ultimately, she broke all ties with Loken, demanding that he leave her in peace. The thought of losing Sif drove Loken to madness. In a fit of anger and jealousy, he lashed out at his love and killed her. Though racked by guilt, he could not bring himself to tell Thorim of what he had done. Loken scrambled for a way to cover up Sif's death. It was in this time of need that her spirit appeared before his eyes. Much to Loken's surprise, this visage of Sif forgave him. She also warned him of the need to act with haste, lest Thorim learn the truth. If he did, the Titan Forge would descend into the civil war, and every pledge Loken had made to the Pantheon would be broken. Sif's suggestion struck Loken as devious, a characteristic he had never known her to possess. He sensed something strange in her spirit, an unseen darkness, subtle yet discernible. but Loken's fear clouded his judgment, and he pushed away his doubts. On Sif's guidance, Loken dragged her corpse into the frigid wastes of the Storm Peaks. He informed Thorim of his wife's demise and convinced the Keeper that Arngrim, king of the Ice Giants, was to blame. The grief-stricken Thorim unleashed his unbridled fury, slaying Arngrim and many of his followers. This event ignited a catastrophic war between Thorim's Storm Giants and Arngrim's Ice Giants. Sif's spirit continued aiding Loken as the conflict raged. Her guidance became ever more extreme and worrisome, but Loken forged ahead nonetheless. She convinced him to build an army of his own using the Forge of Wills, one large enough to protect Ulduar from the depredations of the warring giants. Loken was even persuaded to punish his brother for starting the war. He berated Thorim for letting anger rule his emotions and for creating such a terrible rift between the Titanforged. Loken further admonished his brother, claiming that Sif herself would look upon him in shame if she could only see the things he had done in her name. This bitter condemnation threw Thorim into a deep depression. Overcome with regret, he abandoned Ulduar and languished in solitude. With Thorim in isolation, Loken used his newly forged army to overwhelm the giants and end their conflict. All those who resisted his will were locked away in stasis chambers. But as these battles progressed, Loken noticed something unsettling among his warriors. A dark affliction suffused their spirits. Loken called out to Sif again for advice, but this time she remained silent. Dread overtook the Keeper as he realized that her spirit had not existed at all. She was an illusion created by Yogg-Saron. Though Loken did not know it, the false spirit of Sif had also tainted the Forge of Wills while the Keeper was creating his army. Yogg-Saron's curse of flesh had taken root in the heart of the machine's creation matrix. Loken had, in his selfishness, allowed Yogg-Saron to play him as an unwitting pawn. This discovery shattered the last vestiges of Loken's noble heart. He became obsessed with keeping his transgressions a secret, even if it meant embracing the power of Yogg-Saron. With such might at his command, he knew he could defeat the remaining Keepers and destroy all evidence of his wrongdoing. Part 14. The Sealing of the Halls of Valor. In order to defeat the other Keepers, Loken realized he would first have to neutralize Odin and his mighty Valachar army. But a direct attack against their floating citadel, the Halls of Valor, would be impossible. Instead, Loken took a more insidious approach. He reached out to Odin's adopted daughter, the Valkyr, Helja. For millennia, Helja had dutifully followed Odin's commands, transporting the spirits of slain Vrykul to the Halls of Valor. Yet even while she did so, Helja nursed the cold anger that stirred in her phantom heart. She never forgave Odin for turning her into a Valkyr against her will. Helja dreamed of a day when she might avenge what had been done to her and the others who had been transformed into Valkyr. Loken called out to Helja and played on her simmering anger and feelings of betrayal. He promised he would break the chains of servitude that bound her to follow Odin's will. In exchange, he would seal off the Halls of Valor from the world forever. Thereafter, Helja could usurp Odin's role as the caretaker of all Vrykul spirits. Enticed by this chance to sate her appetite for revenge, she agreed to Loken's plans. After Loken had restored her free will, Helja called on the same power she had used to secure the elemental plane in ages past. She bent the latent arcane energies swirling around Azeroth to her command, sealing off the Halls of Valor and the inhabitants within. Odin and his mighty Valachar struggled desperately to escape their floating citadel, but they could not break the impregnable barrier Helja had created. There, the Valachar and the Keeper would remain, trapped within the golden corridors of the Halls of Valor for ages to come. Helja, now liberated from her life of servitude, forged a new home for herself and the other Valkyr. She created this enchanted refuge far below the Halls of Valor, binding it to Azeroth's great seas. The ocean mists soon coiled up to envelop Helja's domain and shroud it from sight. Known as Helheim, this realm would become the final destination for many Vrykul spirits after death. Yet the darkness that had long festered in Helya's heart transformed Helheim into a place of nightmare and shadow. The souls of dead Vrykul who arrived there soon found themselves turned into vengeful, wraith-like beings. These cursed spirits were known as the Gvaldir. They became one with the ocean mists, bound to the ebb and flow of the tides. The eternal fire of malice and anguish that burned in their souls would drive the Gvaldir to raid and plunder the shores of Kalimdor for all eternity. Time for another snippet. Guardians of Shadow. Not all Valkyr continued to follow Helya after Odin's defeat. Some of these spectral beings disappeared into the Shadowlands. The few who still retained a glimmer of nobility in their souls dedicated themselves to watching over the physical world. From within the Shadowlands, these Valkyr would at times guide the dead back to the land of the living. Part 15. The Fall of the Keepers. With Odin and his Valajar sealed away, Loken returned to Ulduar. He believed he now had ample time to orchestrate the downfall of the other Keepers. Yet he soon discovered a new threat to his plans. Mimiron had begun investigating strange anomalies in Loken's new Titanforged. The brilliant Keeper suspected that some malfunction within the Forge of Wills was to blame for the impurities he had observed. Before he could pursue his theory, Loken sabotaged the Keeper's workshop, killing Mimiron in what appeared to be a tragic accident. Mimiron, however, was not completely dead. Mimiron's faithful mechanomes discovered that their master's spirit lived on. They scrambled to build a giant mechanized body to house the Keeper's fading soul. This heroic act saved Mimiron, but he was never the same again. His brush with death had broken his mind. He secluded himself in Ulduar's vast workshops, spending his days lost in the inner workings of his clockwork inventions. Knowing Mimiron's fate would raise suspicions among the other Keepers, Loken dispatched his army to neutralize his remaining brethren. First, Loken confronted Freya at her verdant domain within the Storm Peaks, the Temple of Life. Battle raged between the two Keepers and their followers, sundering the temple and bleeding its precious life energies dry. Freya struggled valiantly against her foes, but she ultimately fell to Loken and the shadowy powers Yogg-Saron had granted him. Yogg-Saron itself seized on Freya's weakened state, enthralling her spirit. The old god compelled the broken Freya to withdraw into the halls of Ulduar. There, she would spend her forlorn days tending to a sprawling garden at the heart of the fortress. As Loken confronted Freya, another group of his Titanforged waged war on the mighty Keeper Hodir within his lair, the Temple of Winter. Two fire giants named Ignis and Vulcan led the assault. They enveloped the temple in blistering infernos, sapping Hodir's wintry strength and decimating his icy followers. Loken later arrived to subdue Hodir directly, a task he completed with ease. Just as it had done with Freya, Yogg-Saron warped Hodir's mind. The entity forced the Keeper to retreat into a frigid chamber within Ulduar, where he would remain in seclusion for millennia. Two of the remaining Keepers, Tyr and Arcadus, did not fall victim to Loken's schemes. Tyr had long suspected that a darkness was growing within the fallen Keeper, a suspicion that was confirmed when he witnessed Loken's attack on Hodir. Yet Tyr was in no position to confront Loken directly. Throngs of the fallen Keeper's loyal Titanforged stalked the Storm Peaks and the halls of Ulduar. Knowing he stood little chance against this army, Tyr took Arcadus and their close friend, a Titanforged giantess named Ionea, to the outskirts of the Storm Peaks. Among the icy cliffs, they waited and watched Loken's schemes unfold, planning their next move. Loken dispatched his forces to hunt down Tyr and his companions. These Titanforged scoured the mountains and caves of the Storm Peaks, but they never found their prey. Believing that Tyr and his allies had fled the region, Loken asserted sole dominion over Ulduar. He altered the machineries within the fortress and used them to anoint himself the new Prime Designate of Azeroth. He also disabled the tainted Forge of Wills and banished many of his servants to the Storm Peaks. Thereafter, he sealed off the sprawling fortress of Ulduar. Loken languished in regret within Ulduar's silent halls. Despite everything he had accomplished, he was ever fearful that the Pantheon or their appointed watcher, Algalon, would one day return to Azeroth. If that happened, they would discover Loken's horrific crimes and punish him. But in truth, the greatest threat was right beneath Loken's feet. No longer under the watchful eyes of Ulduar's jailers, Yogg-Saron began to stir, working to free itself from its impregnable prison. Part 16. The Vanishing of Ra. As he dealt with the other keepers, Loken always expected that Ra would emerge from the southern reaches of Kalimdor to investigate the goings-on in Ulduar. But much to Loken's surprise, the High Keeper remained silent throughout these world-altering events. Overcome with curiosity, Loken dispatched a contingent of his army to the distant bastion of Uldum to investigate Ra's activities. These Titan-forged agents never found the missing keeper, but they did learn from the local Mogu, Tol'vir, and Anubisaths that Ra had mysteriously vanished. These meetings would have a lasting impact. In journeying south, Loken's forces had unwittingly spread the curse of flesh throughout many of Ra's faithful servants. Unbeknownst to Loken and the Titan-forged, Ra had experienced a revelation, one so terrible that it had driven him into seclusion. When the Pantheon's power and memories had been infused in the Keepers, Ra had reeled in confusion much like his siblings. Over time, however, he had concluded that this event was more than just an anomaly. The influx of power was the last remnant of the Pantheon spirits. Ra struggled to accept the fact that the Pantheon had fallen. He extracted the lingering power of Aman'Thul from himself and carefully stored it in a mountain vault near what would become known as the Vale of Eternal Blossoms. There, the High Keeper hoped to preserve what little was left of his beloved Titan creator. Ra then retreated into the catacombs beneath the land to meditate on what he had learned. With the High Keeper gone, his loyal Titanforge developed new cultures, wholly distinct from those of their northern kin. Most of the Tol'vir congregated around Uldum, making the fortress their home. To the west, the Anubisaths continued their sacred charge of watching over the prison of Cthulhu. Similarly, the Mogu remained in the east, guarding the Titan-forged vaults and machineries buried beneath the earth. Part 17. The Winterskorn War. For many ages after Loken's betrayal, the Titan-forged who were exiled from Ulduar spread across northern Kalimdor. The lumbering giants gradually trickled into the mountains and seas around the region, disappearing from sight. The Earthen tunneled into the deep places of the world, where they fought for dominance against a race of brutish and misshapen creatures known as Trogs. Many of the Vrykul remained above ground, congregating into small clans. Some of these factions wandered the harsh northern landscape as nomads. Others established dwellings across the forested tundra of the region. A tenuous peace existed between these groups of Titan-forged, but it could not last. In time, malign forces moved to assert dominion over the lands once protected by the Keepers. Among these forces were two of Loken's own creations, the brutish fire giants, Vulcan and Ignis. Vulcan and Ignis saw the storm peaks surrounding Ulduar as a land ripe for conquest. Yet to seize the region, they required an army. To this end, the giants turned to the fierce Winterskorn clan of Vrykul. Though many Vrykul were warlike in nature, most avoided direct confrontation with each other. The Winterskorn proved to be an exception. These Vrykul had developed a culture of violence and aggression, due in large part to their belief that they would one day ascend to the halls of Valor. They thrived on conflict, whether it was between members of their own clan or with nearby groups of Titanforged. Vulcan and Ignis took control of the Winterskorn by force and stoked the fires of their battle lust. The giants fortified the metal hides of the Vrykul with enchanted armour. Vulcan and Ignis also forged powerful weapons designed to shatter the iron and stone skin of the other Titanforged. But just as this new army embarked on its great conquest, anomalies began to appear in the Winterskorn. The Vrykul's metallic skin became brittle and weak. They had begun showing the first symptoms of the curse of flesh. Despite this setback, Vulcan and Ignis had no intentions of abandoning their campaign. They also knew that they could no longer rely on the Winterskorn alone to achieve victory. To strengthen the army, Vulcan and Ignis moulded powerful molten golems and iron constructs of their own design. This massive Winterskorn army marched first against the good-natured Earthen, storming their underground lairs. The Earthen were utterly unprepared to face such an overwhelming and organised force. Entire caverns were massacred to the last living creature. A small group of survivors escaped the onslaught and sought the help of Tyr, Arcadus and Ionea, who had thus far eluded Loken's wrath. Incensed by what they had learned, Tyr and his companions immediately journeyed to the Earthen's cavernous homes to aid the beleaguered Titanforged. Tyr himself led the bravest of the Earthen in skirmishes with the Winterskorn, while Arcadus and Ionea constructed defences to ward off future attacks. In time, the Earthen and their allies drove back the Winterskorn. Although their attempts to conquer the Storm Peaks had failed, Vulcan and Ignis did not concede defeat. They returned to their blistering forges and created a new army, one even greater than before. Not satisfied with golems and constructs alone, Vulcan and Ignis crafted enchanted snares with which to enslave entire flights of proto-dragons. These creatures would serve not as mounts, but as beasts of war. The giants outfitted their winged servants with fiery weapons to strike terror into the hearts of the Earthen. The Winterskorn's next brutal assault shattered the Earthen's defences and drove them from their refuge. The Earthen scattered across the icy mountain passes, but they could not escape their foes. Vrykul and golems hunted the Earthen on the ground, while proto-dragons assailed them from the skies. Even Tyr, Arcadus and Ionea were forced to flee from the Winterskorn's fury. Knowing that he and his allies could not defeat the Winterskorn alone, Tyr called on the 5 dragon aspects for help. The noble aspects grew enraged upon seeing so many dead Titanforged. Their fury only deepened when they learned that proto-dragons had been enslaved. Without hesitation, the aspects took wing and unleashed their powers on the Winterskorn's iron ranks. Much as they had done in their fight against Galakrond, the aspects worked in unison to overwhelm the Vrykul army. Alexstrasza held the Winterskorn at bay with towering walls of enchanted fire. Malygos drained the magical essence that fueled the constructs and golems, rendering them useless. He also shattered the enchanted snares that bound the proto-dragons and set the beasts free. Neltharion raised mountains from the earth to corral and contain the Vrykul and their giant masters. Lastly, Ysera and Nosdormu combined their powers to create a spell that would bring a decisive end to the conflict. Ysera and Nosdormu enveloped the Winterskorn in a cloying mist that caused the Titanforged to fall asleep. These incapacitated creatures were then locked away in tomb cities across northern Kalimdor. They would not know the peaceful sleep of the Emerald Dream. Rather, they would languish in a timeless, unconscious slumber for thousands upon thousands of years. In the millennia to come, the curse of flesh would continue warping the sleeping Winterskorn Vrykul. When they eventually awoke, almost every one of them would discover that they had degenerated into mortal creatures of flesh and blood. There's a little snippet here. Trogs and the origins of Uldaman. Following the war with the Old Gods, the Keepers used the Forge of Wills to create new Titanforge to help them reshape the world. Yet their first designs proved too complex and overambitious. Rather than making the perfect servants, they had created stone-skinned savages known as Trogs. The Keepers quickly refined and perfected their designs, and the next generation of Titanforge to emerge from the Forge of Wills would be known as the Earthen. The Keepers were troubled by the Trogs, but they could not bear to destroy them. Instead, Ionaea built a small subterranean vault known as Alderman that would act as a stasis chamber for the Trogs. Some of them escaped imprisonment and wandered the newly ordered world. Others even found their way into the domain of Earth in the elemental plane Deepholm. Chapter 19. The Discs of Norgannon. With the Winterskorn defeated, Keeper Tyr at long last turned his attention to Loken. So long as Ulduar remained sealed off and the Titanforged were divided, more conflicts would arise. Tyr grimly concluded that unless he took action against Loken, Azeroth would spiral into an abyss of war and chaos. But overthrowing Loken would require years of preparation. Tyr and his allies, Arcadus and Ionaea, concluded that they would first need to gather intelligence on Loken and his activities. To this end, they formulated a plan to steal the Discs of Norgannon from the heart of Ulduar. The relics had been recording everything that transpired on Azeroth, including Loken's betrayal. If there was any hope of undoing the damage caused by his schemes, it would be through the careful study of his actions. Having devised a rune to claim the discs, Tyr travelled to the gates of Ulduar itself. There, he called on Loken to relinquish control of Ulduar for the good of Azeroth, threatening dire consequences if he refused. Loken emerged from the fortress to convince Tyr that less drastic measures would suffice. A fierce argument erupted between the two keepers, exactly as Tyr had hoped. While Loken was distracted, Arcadus and Ionaea infiltrated Ulduar and stole the Discs of Norgannon. Once they had secured the artifacts, Tyr and his companions escaped back into the icy crags and ridges of the Storm Peaks. They knew that Loken would soon hunt them down, thus they prepared to journey south, where they hoped to find a refuge from which to plan their next move. Before setting out, Tyr and his allies gathered great numbers of Titanforged who dwelled around Ulduar. A large group of peaceful Vrykul afflicted by the curse of flesh, most of the surviving Earthen, and many of the Mechanomes agreed to take part in the journey. Tyr, Arcadus, and Ionaea saw these Titanforged as innocent victims of Loken's treachery, and they promised to secure them a sanctuary before liberating Ulduar. The refugees travelled for many weeks, believing they had eluded Loken. When Loken learned that the Discs of Norgannon were missing, panic seized him. If Tyr and his allies presented the artifacts to Algalon or the Pantheon, Loken's life would be forfeit. Out of desperation, he turned to the only creatures he knew were powerful enough to stop the mighty Tyr and recover the discs. Ancient Cathraxi monstrosities known as Zakaj and Cathix. Zakaj and Cathix had served as the Black Empire's most ruthless and cunning Cathraxi generals. Long ago, the Keepers had sealed them and many of the other Nraki away in underground chambers alongside the Old Gods. With considerable effort, Loken excavated these Cathraxi tombs and roused Zakaj and Cathix to life. He ordered the colossal abominations to kill Tyr and all who followed him. Sensing the lingering touch of Yogg-Saron in Loken's mind, the two Cathraxi readily obeyed. Far to the south, in a tranquil and temperate glade, Zakaj and Cathix overtook the fleeing Keepers and their followers. Fearing for his allies' lives, Tyr ordered Arcadus and Ionaea to lead the rest of the Titanforged farther south. Meanwhile, he would hold off the Cathraxi for as long as possible. Only the barest shadow of Agramar's old power lingered within Tyr's iron form, but the Titan's noble spirit had not flagged. Tyr would not retreat, not when the lives of innocents were at risk. As he grappled with the Cathraxi, torrents of both arcane and shadow energy ripped through the once peaceful glade. The violent struggle between the Lone Keeper and the Cathraxi raged for 6 days and nights. Through it all, Tyr never gave ground. But neither did his foes. As fatigue set in, Tyr resolved to sacrifice himself to protect his friends. He unleashed all of his remaining power on the Cathraxi, expending his life force in a blinding explosion of arcane energy that shook the bones of the world. To the south, Arcadus and Ionaea watched as the eruption of magic flared across the horizon. After the volatile energy subsided, the two Titanforged ventured back to the site of the battle. There, within a giant crater crackling with arcane magic, they found the lifeless bodies of Tyr and Zakaj. Despite facing hopeless odds, the Keeper of Justice had nearly killed both Cathraxi. The survivor, Cathix, had only narrowly escaped Tyr's vengeful onslaught. The severely wounded Cathrax had blindly fled to the west. It would not be seen again for many thousands of years. In honour of her fallen comrade, Ionaea named the glade surrounding the crater Tyr's Fall, which in the Vrykul tongue translated to Tirisfal. She and her followers buried Tyr and his foe where they lay. They placed Tyr's massive silver hand atop his final resting place as a memorial to his valiant sacrifice. Although all of the refugees would carry on the story of Tyr's noble sacrifice, the Vrykul in particular felt compelled to do something more. They were so moved by the Keeper's deeds that they decided to settle at the battle site and stand vigil over Tyr's grave until the end of their days. Arcadus and Ionaea honoured the Vrykul's wishes to settle the land of Tirisfal. The Keeper and the Giantess continued south with the Earthen and Mechanomes in tow. They eventually stopped at the easternmost Titanforge vault on Kalimdor, Uldaman. Arcadus and Ionaea expanded the site, carving out new chambers to hold the Discs of Norgannon, and vowing to protect the history of Azeroth with their lives if need be. As the years passed, some of the Earthen exhibited signs of the Curse of Flesh. Many of these Titanforged feared that the effects would only worsen. They asked to be placed in hibernation until a cure could one day be found. Arcadus, promising to rouse them at some time in the future, agreed. He sealed his followers within Uldaman's vast subterranean vaults. The Mechanomes, however, remained awake. Even though they knew the curse would one day overtake them as well, they heroically vowed to watch over Uldaman and maintain its wondrous machineries. In distant Ulduar, Loken became desperate upon learning that his Cathraxi had failed to kill his foes. He assumed that with the mighty Tyr dead, Arcadus and Ionaea would not attempt a direct assault upon Ulduar, but the Discs of Norgannon still posed a threat to him. Stealing or destroying the artifacts was no longer an option. Arcadus and Ionaea could easily seal off Uldaman from intruders. Instead, Loken attempted to replace the Discs of Norgannon with an archive of his own design, one that he dubbed the Tribunal of Ages. He adjusted the historical events contained in this new repository to his liking and expunged his sins from the record. Though he assumed he had been successful, his archive proved to be flawed. The histories stored within were warped even beyond Loken's understanding. Loken then took one final drastic measure to prevent retribution from Arcadus and Ionaea. He believed that his enemies would eventually summon the Constellar Algalon. To stop this, Loken altered the Titan communication devices in Ulduar. This assured that no living creature would be able to contact Algalon. Only Loken's own death would draw the Constellar to Azeroth. The Fallen Keeper assumed that his demise would come at the hands of Arcadus and Ionaea. If so, he was confident that Algalon would take his revenge for him by wiping out every living creature on Azeroth's surface. This chapter also has a snippet, and this one is titled Tyr's Sacrifice. The mortals who would one day inhabit the area of Tirisfal would feel two conflicting energies emanating from the earth. The remaining spiritual essence of Keeper Tyr, and that of his enemy, Zakaj. Some would tap into Tyr's energies, others would become attuned to the Cathrax's dark aura. Chapter 20. Children of Giants, the Rise of Humanity. With the Winterskorn asleep in their deep vaults, and many of the Earthen sealed within Uldaman, the remaining Vrykul clans dominated the lands of northern Kalimdor. Over the course of eons, their disparate cultures flourished in unique ways. They developed their own identities and customs as they spread across the unforgiving north. One of the mightiest clans to arise was the Dragonflayer. Much like the Winterskorn, these Vrykul found that their iron hides were gradually turning to flesh over time. Initially, the clan leaders sought to balance out their diminishing strength by enslaving the ancient proto-dragons, just as the Winterskorn had done in previous centuries. But unlike the Winterskorn, the Dragonflayers did not see the proto-dragons as mere beasts of war. They used the fearsome drakes as hunting companions, and they also rode them as battle mounts. Over time, these proto-dragons became an inseparable part of the clan's culture. They were also a necessary weapon against the Vrykul's mortal enemy, a fierce race of bearmen called the Yalgar, the progenitors of modern-day furbolgs. Under King Yimmeron, Dragonflayer clan finally gained the upper hand against its foes. In a coordinated offensive, the Vrykul attacked and drove the Yalgar into Kalimdor's lush central forests. Yet on the heels of this victory, tragedy struck. The curse of flesh took another turn. Dragonflayer women began giving birth to small, malformed children, a development that spread fear and superstition among the clan. Some of the Vrykul even blamed Yimmeron for the affliction, but the king had his own belief about who was responsible. In his mind, the mythical Keepers were behind the curse of flesh. The Keepers, whom many Vrykul viewed as their godlike creators, had not been seen or heard from in generations. Yimmeron convinced his people to renounce the silent and aloof Keepers, who had clearly abandoned them to the curse of flesh. He promised to unite all Vrykul under his banner. As his first decree, Yimmeron ordered his followers to cleanse the clan by destroying all of the malformed infants. Many of the Dragonflayers obeyed Yimmeron's brutal orders. Some, however, could not bring themselves to murder innocent children. They sought to hide their stunted offspring in a place of legend, a land far to the south where a lost clan of Vrykul was said to have journeyed with Tyr, Arcadus, and Ionaea. A number of Dragonflayers ventured south, taking their diminutive newborns in search of this fairy tale refuge. Most were never heard from again, but others did find their way. With heavy hearts, they left their beloved sons and daughters in the care of the Vrykul who inhabited Tirisfal. In the ages that followed, the afflicted children and their offspring would continue degenerating into mortal beings called humans. Many of the other Titan-forged, Mechanomes, Tolvir, Mogu, and Giants would suffer a similar fate. Very few of the Keeper's servants would fight off the affliction. Just as Yogg-Saron had hoped, the curse of flesh would weaken the Titan-forged, but it would also give rise to mortal qualities of necessity that the old god had never anticipated. Courage, resolve, and heroism. Unaware that these potent traits would one day shape the fate of the world, Yogg-Saron and the other old gods focused on escaping their prisons. Freedom, however, would take thousands of years to attain. For now, more immediate dangers stirred in the lush heart of Kalimdor. A new power, a savage native race born in the early ages of the world, was on the rise. They called themselves Trolls, and it would not be long before they learned of the malignant entities imprisoned beneath the earth. And we have one final snippet for this chapter, and it is titled The Dragonflayers and the Long Slumber. The Dragonflayers struggled to purge themselves of the curse of flesh in many ways. Despite all of their efforts, they would remain addled and weakened by the affliction. Eventually, these Vrykul would place themselves in hibernation in the hopes of staving off the curse of flesh.